So my name is Caitlin Boise. I'm also with RES Res, and I am going to give a little retrospective look at water quality during the drawdown and dam removal, with the caveat being that we could spend days, weeks, months, years talking about this. So this is going to really just scratch the surface on a few things, but I will be around today if folks want to talk more about anything in particular. My email will also be up at the end. I'm always happy to schedule a time to talk through your location or parameter of interest in more detail if anyone wants to do that. So I'm going to cover a few of the key dates that Dave kind of already mentioned and briefly touch on some of the continuous data that we collected in the last year or so. I won't talk about that too much because I know that a lot of you have been keeping tabs on the Karuk portal and what water quality is doing in the system, but I'll also be sharing some of our grab sample results, talking through some of those. And also touching on our approach to data management and sharing, because that was a really key part of this whole effort over the last 8 months. And then I will have some time for questions at the end, hopefully, if we can stay on time. So stepping back to the beginning of the year, in January, drawdown was initiated on January 9th with the opening of the diversion tunnel at Iron Gate. Followed a week later by the tunnel blast at J.C. Boyle, which initiated drawdown at that location, and then another week after that at COPCO number 1 with that tunnel blast. So we saw drawdown happen over the course of the winter and spring, and then at the beginning of March, we had this series of geomorphic flow releases, which we're going to see the effects of those on water quality in the system. And then a few months later, the final cofferdam breach at J.C. Boyle, followed by the cofferdam breaches at COPCO number 1 and Iron Gate, culminating in all in water construction work being completed and the dams being removed. Woohoo. So briefly, these are our continuous monitoring locations. We have 9 stations from the estuary up to Kino, about 240 miles of river. Today, I'm mostly going to be looking at Iron Gate, has some of the most interesting data for us to see. And as a reminder for the context, this monitoring is all required by the 401 certifications for the project. So this is all compliance driven as part of the approvals of the dam removal project. And this is data being collected in 15-minute intervals, beginning with the pre-drawdown baseline year. So we started in 2023 as our baseline data collection year. We're collecting DO, pH, specific conductance, temperature, turbidity, and discharge at some of the sites as well. And this data is reported on a monthly basis to agencies and tribes. And compliance around this data is going to be focused on comparison to both the baseline year of data. So we'll be comparing our drawdown and post-dam removal data to that 2023 data, as well as some numeric criteria set forth by the Water Board for some parameters. So I'm going to show this plot, which Dave and Randy have actually already shown today, but this is going to have dissolved oxygen. It's cut off on the side there, but on the left-hand y-axis, we'll have dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter, and that'll be in blue, and then turbidity in orange in FNU. And this is just going to show the first 4 months of the year to start out with, so January through April. Obviously, there is some missing data. This is related to some of the fouling and QA/QC of data happening during drawdown. Some of the sensor got buried a few times, but a pretty complete record overall, given the conditions that we were experiencing. And I just want to step through some of those dates from that timeline that we saw. So drawdown was initiated at Iron Gate at the beginning of January. Didn't see a huge response in that case because of the location of the tunnel, and as Dave mentioned, kind of where the sediment was at that point. We also didn't see an effect from the initiation of drawdown at J.C. Boyle because the reservoirs were still in place, so that material signal didn't show up downstream. We did, however, see an effect once drawdown began at COPCO, so that's when we saw kind of our biggest mobilization of material into the downstream reaches and subsequent effects on DO. And then in March, we also saw these peaks in turbidity as material was mobilized during these geomorphic flow releases. So these were using some of the environmental water account water kind of discussions among basin partners and lots of groups to best figure out how to mobilize some sediment and use this water to do so. And looks like we did mobilize some sediment. We see those 3 peaks as flows came through. And then we also see this kind of decreasing background level, which indicates that we were moving material and sort of lowering that background level that was available for movement throughout the former reservoir reaches. Now I'm going to add on the rest of the year's data, so same plot, but now through mid-October. And the next date on our timeline was that breaching of the coffer dam at J.C. Boyle. And we actually did see this picked up at the Iron Gate gauge because we had more of a free-flowing river condition. We got to watch that transit time of turbidity from J.C. Boyle to Iron Gate, which took about 20 hours, if anyone's interested. And then, as Dave mentioned, that cofferdam breach, that initial breach at Copco and Iron Gate, we did see a large mobilization event. We saw material moving down past the Iron Gate gauge and a subsequent drop in DO. But in the following weeks, as more work was done to remove the remaining pieces of the cofferdam, there was a lot of communication and coordination between RES, KRC, McMillan, Kiewit to ensure that even though more material was being mobilized and sent downstream, it was maintained at a level where DO was not significantly impacted until that final removal occurred. And many of you were on those email threads and those calls and those meetings to coordinate that. So that was a really huge effort. And we did see, when that final piece of the Iron Gate cofferdam came out, really short drop in DO, a matter of hours, and then a swift recovery. And since then, turbidity has really been at what I think we can call winter background levels, 10 or 20 FNU at this point. And then I also just really want to talk about temperature quickly, because temperature is really interesting at Iron Gate. This is temperature, degrees C, in 2023. And this is the daily min and daily max. And we have a really narrow range of daily min and daily max at Iron Gate in the baseline year in 2023. Not more than 2 degrees any given day. But if we throw 2024 up there, we see much wider range in daily temperatures. We also see, I can't have a pointer on here, this earlier warming in the spring, maybe. I don't know if everyone can see that, but whoops. Earlier warming in the spring. Oh, are you folks on Zoom? Okay. Oh, there we go. This period here, and then potentially this earlier cooling in the fall. And these kind of adjustments to the temperature regime and these larger daily fluctuations were really one of the big intended project benefits. And the fact that we're seeing this in year 1 is really encouraging, and it's great to see. It's a benefit that we can already see happening in the river. So moving on to grab samples. These are our 9 grab sample locations. They are almost the same as our continuous stations. However, we do not collect grab samples at the Walker Bridge continuous station, which is located here, but we do collect grab samples above the former Copco Reservoir below Shovel Creek at this location. And I want to talk about metals today because there was a lot of discussion of metals during drawdown. But a little bit of context first. These samples are collected monthly, so 1 discrete sample each month. And they were also collected starting in the baseline year, so in 2023. You can see some of the parameters we collect there. And these are also submitted in monthly reports to agencies and tribes. These are reported after the fact because it does take some time for us to get results back from labs, but these are reported out and publicly available. And future compliance for these parameters is also going to be compared to the baseline year, as well as some narrative criteria set forth by the Water Board. So with that, let's look at dissolved aluminum. So this is a plot of our grab samples dissolved aluminum over the course of 2023 in this yellowish color, and then 2024 in blue. here. This is showing dissolved aluminum in milligrams per liter. However, I think the big takeaway that I want to show from this is the samples we collected during drawdown were not the highest concentration samples we collected for this project. Those were actually during the first part of 2023. We do see this pattern of dissolved aluminum, and likely that's related to turbidity levels in the river, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But this is just at Iron Gate, but now looking at the results just for September at all of our monitoring locations. So this is Iron Gate down to the estuary. So these are the 5 locations where we sample for aluminum. And yes, dissolved aluminum is higher at our monitoring sites. However, this was collected on September 3rd, which, if you remember what turbidity was doing in the river on September 3rd, I know I do, it was still pretty high and elevated from that cofferdam breach. So those levels were sort of starting to drop at Iron Gate at that point, but that kind of wave of mobilized material was making it downstream right around Orleans at this point. So not surprising that we have over 100 years of sediment built up behind the dams. They're making their way down the river. We have some increased levels of some of these analytes. And that is, so this difference right here at Orleans, this is about 1/10 of a milligram per liter difference. But then if we look at July, which had much lower turbidity levels, we see these levels are still increased, but it's about 1/100th of a milligram per liter. So not as much of a difference when turbidity levels are lower. Oops. And then just really quickly, methyl mercury, because metals, like I said, were such a topic of discussion. This is also at Iron Gate across 2023 and 2024. Levels still, like with dissolved aluminum, not the highest levels recorded during drawdown, highest levels recorded during our baseline year in 2023. And we see a really similar pattern if we look at all of our sampling sites. So in this case, we sample methyl mercury at 6 locations, from Daggett Bridge down to the estuary, where that wave of turbidity in September was making its way downstream, and that's where we saw the highest level. So to kind of wrap all this up, I want to talk a little bit about our approach and tools we used with data management and sharing, because a lot of data was generated by the compliance requirements for this project. In January and through October alone, we collected over 260,000 data records. And each of those records includes multiple parameters that are being collected and managed by different organizations, different entities we work with. They're in different formats. So how do we make sure that the data that we are getting is updated and ready for sharing with project partners and used in real-time decision-making, as we saw was needed during those cofferdam breaches? And one of the tools that we've been using, and some of you may be familiar with this, but it's called Feature Manipulation Engine, or FME. And it's a software that allows you to graphically build these kind of flowchart looking workflows to extract and transform geospatial data. So we use the existing APIs from the Group Water Quality Data Portal and USGS to pull the parameters we're interested in from each location, combine them, ensure that they're time aligned and the data records are complete. And then our FME workspaces are set up to automatically do this throughout the day. So we are automatically updating our data and writing it to a spatial database throughout the day. And then this spatial database is connected to several Tableau workbooks. And for those of you who may not have used Tableau, it's a plotting and graphing software that's really interactive and great for sharing real-time data, and also kind of changing time frames you're looking at and statistics on the fly. So for instance, this is a plot of our estimated and modeled mean suspended sediment concentration that we were able to share. Many of you saw this throughout many calls during the drawdown. So just to summarize all of that, during drawdown and dam removal, we did record effects to water quality throughout the Klamath River. And as was anticipated and modeled and predicted, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, temperature, and other parameters were affected by project activities. Increased turbidity was expected, but also expected to be temporary, while others like this more natural temperature regime was expected to be a benefit of the project. Grab sample results so far, it seems like were strongly tied to turbidity and what turbidity was doing in the river. And data management and sharing have been an integral part of the process of monitoring and responding to water quality during the drawdown and dam removal process, something that I'm sure Randy and KBMP would also like to second. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here and highlight our project team that's doing a lot of this work on the ground, and happy to take any questions if there are any. No. Oh, do you want? Okay. Yeah.
Mike, why don't you try? I'll see if I can get this on.
Yeah. So I'm a consumer of the crude tribe. One thing I noticed is that the stations downriver at Shasta and Walker Bridge are higher turbidity than the one at Iron Gate. And that was like pretty frequent. I was just wondering, like, is that real or is that an instrumentation artifact?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was asking about the stations downstream of Iron Gate showing higher turbidity than what's being shown at Iron Gate. And there could be a couple reasons related to that. In some instances, the Iron Gate sensor had probably reached its upper limit. So the data it was reporting was kind of at this flat cap that was no longer accurate, whereas the stations downstream were maybe reporting more accurate data. There were also instances, folks reported who were on the ground saying that because of some of the influence of Bogus Creek above the Iron Gate station, and because some of the high turbidity flows were super viscous and not mixing with that bogus input, that Iron Gate may have actually, the gauge itself, which is on that Bogus Creek side, may have actually been experiencing lower turbidities.
Those high levels of aluminum and methyl mercury that you saw in 2023 in those grab samples, do you have any explanation for those?
I don't at this point. I think those were during higher flow periods during the year when there was higher turbidity in the river. But I'm also open to what other folks might, if other folks have thoughts about why that could have happened. They are just, grab samples, one snapshot in time. So it's really easy to collect high levels at that point when you're doing that kind of sampling.
And then just one more, it looked like the levels on the of both were going up on the continuous stations as the river moved downstream to Orleans, like the highest levels were at Orleans. And I'm wondering if there's any hypothesis as to why that would be.
Yeah, I think that was just related to where the increased turbidity was at that time. So I think Iron Gate in September, the turbidity levels from the cofferdam breach had already dropped. So that's why it was a little bit lower than at Orleans, where that turbidity was kind of peaking at that point. So that's where the most of that mobilized material was. So I think we'll be getting our October samples back soon. And I think those will show much lower levels because the turbidity has been so low in the month of October. Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
My question is, you had 9 sites around the Klamath, but with the metal stuff like the methyl mercury, only 6 sites were measuring that. Like, how do you choose those 6 sites out of those 9?
Yeah, those 6 sites were prescribed by the management plans that were developed in advance of the project. That's related to the former reservoirs being listed for methyl mercury due to historic inputs. Same thing with aluminum. The river's listed downstream of Iron Gate, and that's just kind of naturally occurring high background levels. So it's related to where in the river those are expected to be found.